All right, let me welcome everyone here to the 33rd Annual Conference of the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York. The person that was just speaking is Claudia Darcy. She is our conference coordinator, and we have a lot of coalition staff on this call right now. And thank you all for being here. So I'm gonna start with introducing our keynote. Sixto Cancel. Sixto grew up in and aged out of the child welfare system. He has been advocating for change at the intersection of child welfare and advanced technology since the age of 16. His personal lived experience has powered a passion to transform the child welfare system so that every person has the conditions they need to heal, develop, and thrive. As one of the creators of the hashtag HACKFOSTERCARE movement, Sixto has amplified national conversations around data in child welfare, assembled stakeholders from diverse disciplines, and delivered concrete results for the field. He is the founder and CEO of Think of Us, which operates as a research and development lab for child welfare, transforming the system so that people with lived experience are at the center of designing, imagining, and building. Sixto believes that centering the lived experience of people whose lives are touched by the system, foster youth, foster parents, caregivers, caseworkers, judges, funders, allow us to co-design solutions and shift the dynamics that hold problems in place. I just read you the official bio, and it was beautifully written, so I wanted to read it. Now, let me tell you, you're about to hear a visionary, both a thought provoker and a thought leader, a person who has the ear of the Biden administration. I worked from 2014 to 2016 as a Wendy's Wonderful Kids recruiter all over the state of Connecticut, the system that Sixto aged out of. Everybody knew of him to the point that I had to reach out to him myself. And I did a radio interview with him on a program I hosted back then in November of 2016. Mark my words, if by chance this is the first time you have ever heard of Sixto, it will be absolutely positively not the last. Fellow conference participants, I present to you the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the social entrepreneur category in 2017. He just turned 30 the other day. Sixto Cancel. Welcome, Sixto.
Thank you, Pat. That was such a great introduction and so appreciative of it and so appreciative of the stuff I see in the chat. One of the things I want to say is, Pat, you've left an endearing mark on me too when I was a young kid. As many of you can imagine, when you grow up in foster care, you have certain views, and adoption for as a teenager was not one of them that I'll share a little bit more earlier. But it was in Washington, D.C. I was probably 19 at the time. And I was really pushing preparation for young people. And Pat came up to me and he challenged the idea in such a respectful, honorable way. And that really left a lasting mark on me, where I went back and really thought to myself, wow, am I letting myself be jaded by my own experiences? And now, 10 years later, the main thing that we're pushing is family. The main thing that we're pushing is permanency. Saying preparation for adulthood is not enough. It is the bare minimum requirement, and that we really need to push family. So, Pat, that was literally the conversation outside of Capitol Hill after the briefing. And so that you take that and know that you influenced me very strongly. So I'm so happy to be here with you all today, because it feels like such a full circle moment.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So today I'm excited to be here with you all. I'm going to share a little bit about the way I come to this work and a little bit of my personal journey and new parts of my personal journey that have been coming out. And then I want to share a little bit with you all about some of the work and end it with some of the things that we're seeing, and even show you some data. I'm going to encourage folks to go ahead and feel free when we're talking about some of the projects to interject. And I'll tell you when that is, and to be able to go ahead and ask a question or two, so I can make it conversational. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, love the visuals. Thank you everyone for putting your thumbs up and emojis, however you want to respond. Alrighty. So like I said, I run an organization called Think of Us, and we're a systems change organization. And we literally believe that we should be living in a set of conditions, in a community, in an ecosystem where it is structured in such a way that it enables healing, it enables the development, and it really positions our youth and our families to be able to thrive, not just be self-sufficient or meet the bar. So I'll start off with where my journey began. Definitely began as an 11-month baby. I entered the foster care system at that time, but I actually will say probably my story begins a little bit before that with my biological mother. My bio mom at the age of 12 was experienced sexual abuse from her stepfather. And she went and finally revealed that to her mom. And I guess her mom felt like she couldn't take care of all of them, or she had to figure out how she would be able to live, like be able to have a place to sleep and eat without him. So unfortunately, the response was to abandon my mother. So from the age of 12 all the way to 21, she was homeless, right? She did not have a place to sleep. She didn't go to school. She didn't have what every child should have. So 5 years later, when she's 26, she has me. And so 11 months into that journey is when I came to the attention of child welfare because of poverty and drug addiction. And what I'll note is that in her story, her assignment to treatment was to do a rehab program. Then it was to do a drug program. Then it's a rehab program, do a parenting program. But today, what we don't have are the concrete interventions that actually get at the root of what needed to be healed, that deep trauma. And then even when that work is done, what is the other work that needs to be done to be able to develop the skill sets so that you can actually earn enough income to take care of your multiple children? And so the systemic gaps there are part of her story, and it's part of my story because that is why I found myself in the foster care system. I did get to live with her between my biological mom and some siblings between 6 and 7. But by the time I was 7, I was back in the foster care system. And by the time I was 9, I was adopted. And this adoption was a pretty abusive adoption, unfortunately. It was a pretty racist adoption. While the other kids got to be able to go to a private school, she told me because I was Black, I had to go to a public school. While they got to be part of after school activities, those were not the things that she felt that I was worthy of. They got to be part of family portraits. They got to be part of the season pass to the amusement parks. Those were not things that I was able to be part of. This was someone who really, had very strong views about people of color. So the first time that I called the hotline, and started to say these things, it felt so distant to them. They didn't really believe me at all. They thought I was making it up. And so one day I was watching Law and Order. Um, I love Law and Order. And I was watching Law and Order, and what ended up happening was I started to realize that I needed to make a case. I really needed to be able to record the evidence and to be able to actually say, okay, here's what's happening. And so I spent so much of my early teens during that time. I was now 13. Between 13 and 15 is when this all started happening. So 13, I started just to journal and just to figure things out. But the reality is that it wasn't enough for a long time. I actually ended up having to couch surf between 13 and 15 quite a bit with the folks that you see in this picture here, and really having to figure it out. But I finally got smart and was able to say, okay, I need to stop having all the recordings get found. And I started to tape the recorders to my chest. And I finally was able to use that to get back into the system. But it was only when literally, only when I came back to the house with the recordings and with an investigative worker that I actually was then officially removed into that 72-hour hold. This is actually the house I used to live in. that court date was so interesting because I don't know what was written for this judge, but whatever was written for this judge, it seemed to me that it must have painted a picture about me because she was very hostile to me. During the hearing, there was this moment where, she's asking all of these questions. And I finally just write on a piece of paper to my lawyer who was there that day. And I said, hey, ask them if I'm in, ask the social worker if I'm in any family photos. And so the lawyer asked that, and the worker was like, no, not at all, you know? And that was kind of like the defining moment to kind of churn the court case. But in reality, she said to me, if this foster home doesn't work out for you, you will go to another foster home. This is the power of making sure that young people have a chance to have a voice in the paperwork, because what I later found out was that because I had recorded the abuse on a recorder without her permission in Connecticut, it's a two-party state, none of that could come into official evidence. So the judge only could read what she had available to her. This was not something that she had no clue. So all she read was, oh, this kid had 7 open investigations, keeps calling the hotline, and the things that people sometimes thought I was lying about. But at least the worker in the room knew, because I had just started to press play. So I come into foster care. That was at 15 again, and then I ended up aging out. But 3 years ago, I get a phone call from my sister while I'm in New York City. And she's like, hey, do you want to go to a family reunion? And I was like, of course, And so we end up going to the family reunion in Spanish Harlem. And the thing about me is I'm Afro-Latino, so I'm Puerto Rican. And we come in all different shades and colors and shapes, you name it. And so walking through a park trying to figure out which group of people are your family is like a guessing game for the century, because anybody basically could be. You don't know if you're a Puerto Rican family that's like more people who look like me, or people more Spaniard looking Puerto Rican. So like, you just never know. And so we finally end up at this one spot of the barbecue, and I get there, and it was just such a, I can't even put words to the moment, because it was such an emotional moment to, after all these years, to actually find, family, and biological family at that. But unfortunately, while I was there was a moment where I was just like stopped in my tracks. And that was because when I was there, I realized that there was this, I kept asking questions like, who's who? And people were like, oh, that's our cousin, this our aunt. And then finally, there was this moment where I saw some children who were clearly not, related to us. And I started asking about them, and they're like, oh, that's our little cousins. That's our little cousins. And then finally someone was like, yeah, we adopted them. And it turned out that there were 4 uncles and aunts that I have who are foster adoptive parents. And at that very moment, all I can do is pull out my phone, open up Gmap, Google Maps, and Google to my last foster home that I aged out of. And it was 58 miles away. 58 miles away, I had always had family, but not just family, people who were actually adopting from the foster care system. And this kind of stopped me in my tracks so hard. And after reflecting for so many months now, it really hit me hard, because my entire life I was told from the 11 months, you are a foster kid. Even when I was adopted at 9, I still felt like a foster kid. When I turned around and was back in the system, I was a foster kid. And then I accepted around 15 that I was going to age out. And when you accept that you're going to age out, you accept that kind of family has gone. Like the opportunity for family is just no longer existence, right? That's not true, but as the 15-year-old, that's exactly what I believed. And so that's exactly how I approached every foster home. This is an agreement. As long as you stay out of my way, I stay out of your way, I'll do good in school. You don't bother me, and make sure I get my allowance. Like, that's how I showed up in those spaces. But in this very moment, what happened was all that narrative and all those beliefs about there's no family, there's no place to go, behave so that you don't go to a group home. that all shattered in that very moment. And I look back and I said, well, how did we get here? You know, and one of the things I realized is that in the right-hand corner is the photo of that day of the reunion. Then the second photo where you see that's my older brother who could have been a resource and could have taken me in if we had the right supports. And he was trying to save money so that he can get an apartment and then get licensed. And unfortunately, he had to go back to the poverty of Puerto Rico into the projects, and unfortunately died to gun violence. Then you have an email here where you see two of my cousins literally signing up for, like, literally me bringing them to Wendy's Wonderful Kids. Right there as a result of the reunion. And on the left-hand picture, that's my father. And that's his wife, his ex-wife, who's my mother's mother. I mean, excuse me, who's my sister's mother. Sorry, got that all confused. And so, like, the opportunity for family in so many of these moments was like there, but it didn't happen. And so I had to ask myself, like, where systematically did this go wrong? And here is an actual page from my case file. And it said Sixto refused reunification and adoption, no viable resource for transfer of guardianship. Now, I don't know what they said after that because they blocked that out, not me. And this is an important line because it was at this very moment, I believe, that when they wrote these lines, these two sentences, this is what made every single social worker for decades behave in the way that they did, where they never even asked me about biological family. They never said, hey, is there something that, is there someone that you recently connected with? You know, connecting with family is fluid, especially during your teenage years. And so those conversations never happen. And like, this almost feels like it was the life sentence that was written on a piece of paper. This is why, you know, when I got into foster care, again at 15, this is why I started to do advocacy. You know, all of these experiences from going to home, going to these different places. I was not mad at the system for being adopted by someone who manipulated the system. What I was angry about was the fact that they didn't believe me once I had found my voice. That they was quickly like, oh no, you're just having your troubled teenage years. I finally went to college, and this is actually the first day of college. And I show this image because two things are happening in this photo. Number one, day number one, I found another foster kid who lived in the area. And of course, she was like, oh, I'll bring you to places where you can go buy stuff for your apartment. And then number two, you know, the absence of adults is really prevalent because, as you can see, we bought a coffee table too large for the car to fit. And so that's what's actually sticking out of the trunk there. But there's these monumental moments where I feel like every young person should be having, you know, those family-like connections, that deep bond. And then sometimes we have these very pivotal moments with, like, one, strangers, and two, with the absence of the wisdom of adults who could be at those very moments. And so for me, this is where I really start to think differently about, like, what could we do in terms of advocacy. I was part of so many different initiatives at the national level, at the state level. And when I went to the Clinton Global Initiative University, which is this summit where the Clinton Foundation brings together 1,000 students creating change all over the world, but making commitments of action to actually solve problems within a year span. I went there and realized, like, I needed results. To this point, I had just been sharing a very sad story. I had been sharing a story for other people's efforts, being on panels for other people's efforts, but that I was really questioning what was my real contribution, because I was so petrified that here I was being able to participate in all these things, but that when I turned literally 30, I used to think that I would just be, like, thrown away because I would just be too old, you know, to be sharing a story, too irrelevant to be sharing the story, and that I needed to actually be able to go ahead and figure out what was my true contribution. And so I went on a journey, and I started to do, you know, to start to lean in first in research. And my first research question was, how do I change 1,000 workers' behavior over state lines, over county lines, different systems, without announcing a new initiative and without convincing people that they should do something differently? Because it was clear to me announcing new things lasts about 18 months, because that's about how long commissioners and directors sometimes stick around. And as I started to dig through, I just started to realize, wow, there's this thing called the case management system. And when the case management system has something written in it, it is almost treated like the law. Or when there's a question in it, man, people just move. And so at that very moment, I was like, wow, if we put a question in software, the software system, the case management system that said, what is under a child's bed? Just tomorrow, just press publish on that. And all of a sudden your software is all over the country for saying this. You would literally have workers looking under children's bed and writing it, because that has to go into the court report. And so I became super obsessed with this. I became super obsessed with this and launched Think of Us to go ahead and figure out, how do we have an app where young people would be able to go ahead and be able to have voice and choice. And I'll share a little bit more later on that. This is where the 1.0 version of this organization began. And now today, what we learned was that it's so much more than just a technical problem, that we needed to actually have a research and design lab that is focused in child welfare, to focus on how to actually transform the system, right? How do we actually transform the system? And to make sure that we are actually looking at problems, not from the kind of just the experience of, hey, we need to fix this one thing, but how do we fundamentally change the architect of the actual system? We look at these as being the 6 conditions of systems change. There's a mental model that we have a belief around, right? The way that we think about things in a certain way. And then that actually influences how we actually enable certain power dynamics and connections, which are reinforced by policy, practice, and resource flow. So when I think about our current system today, at one point we made the decision that one person, right, and a judge could have the authority to go ahead and make decisions about removing children. That power is given to that person to go ahead and remove those decisions. And that creates a certain type of connection with the community, a certain type of relationship with the community. And that's reinforced by the policy and practices and how the money is spent. And so when we change when we start to change the cocktail mix of these things, that's when we start to be able to actually change the actual architect of the system. And so our 2.0 of our organization is focused on systems change. How do we do projects that allow us to really be able to, um, um, disrupt the way people think about things, or maybe disrupt the policy first, and then that changes the way people think about things, or maybe you disrupt the money first, and that changes the way people think about things. But it's all about actually being able to go ahead and disrupt the way things are going. I'll share with you where a lot of the origin of the current foster care system comes from. And many people believe it begins with the orphan trade, and I'll get to that in a second. But I did a little bit of research and traced it back to England. And I traced it back to the moment where, excuse me, I traced it back to a moment where we had, what you call it? Sorry, there's some folks behind us. So I traced it back to England, and when King Henry decided to leave the church, right, the Catholic Church, something happened, which is he separated. And when he established his new church, he forgot that the church played one huge function, which is they taxed the local people to actually take care of the poor, right? And so the church used to be an institution that people who were in need would go to. And one of the things that happened, because it was so hyper local, was that it wasn't a one size fit all. It was hey, what do you need support on? And then folks would receive that support. Fast forward to 1601, Queen Elizabeth I, as a result of that that new church being established, what ended up happening was that they didn't have that function of who was taking care of the poor and people in need. So all of a sudden, government had to figure out now for the first time, how was it that they were going to go ahead and they were going to go ahead and be able to actually like write legislation that would help folks who were poor. And two things came out of this, what they call the poor man's laws. Number one, it was who's worthy and unworthy of support. So they literally wrote legislation talking about who are the people who are worthy of support, right? And define that. And number two, this moment created the one size fits all. So they created pathways of saying, here's the working alum's house, right? Here are these houses where we're going to put people into and you're going to work. And so they create the one size fit all. This is where I believe a lot of the basis of our social system was created. This idea that the more you behave with your worker, the more resources you get and the more privileged, because what? You're quote, quote, more worthy, right? The idea that we have one system that the intervention is that we remove, we turn around, try to reunite, or we try to go ahead and transfer guardianship, or we try to go ahead and find you another forever family. Those are all kind of off the premise of this one size fit all and this pipeline way of functioning. And so at that very moment, I feel like we created some of the foundations and principles of this current system. And to like get super technical, literally in the colony of Virginia, in Jamestown, the first laws around social services and children were literally copied from England. So there's a direct transfer, not even just an opinion here. Fast forward to the 200 years later to the 1800s, we have the orphan train movement. And this is where, you know, in the city of New York, children were being placed on trains and placed in the middle of the country, in different parts of the country, to go ahead and be able to work the farms, but also like have a family. And so you'd be placed there. And the idea was that you would have a family, but then you also would be placed on a farm where you all would work it, which was very cultural for the day. But I believe that at that point, that's where even more of the transactional pieces of the child welfare came in. The premise that we go ahead and place you and there's something that in exchange that you're getting. And so these are kind of some of the mental models that really drive some of the system. And when we look at our process at the highest level today, what do we see? We start every single engagement with the family and screening and assessing for risk, whether that be at the investigation, whether that be at the case planning side, whether that be just even your licensing of your home, right? And so we have a system that's looking at risk versus actually looking at how do we actually support and enable healing and enable development. One of the things that I'll point out here, excuse me, is that then once you have determined what the level of risk is or not, you go into this phase of, okay, here's a plan. And many times that plan is created without you. And so when that plan is created, then it's all about compliance. And based on your compliance, you either get moved, you know, out, in, left, right, you name it, right? But we've built a system that is not based on you know, centering how do we keep families together or how do you extend a forever family. It's actually built on how do you assess all of these risks, determine what's broken, and then put a plan in place for someone else. And that is why we were so obsessed with how do you build software that would allow young people, that would allow caregivers, whether they be foster, adoptive, or kin, and others, to actually be able to put their own information in. Every single year, we are spending literally billions of dollars on software and child welfare in the child welfare system. To put this in context, in New York City, the child welfare, the case management system there cost over $400 million. California, $94 million a year. Half of that's reimbursed by the federal government. To put this all in perspective, there is right now only $20 million that goes to kinship care from the Children's Bureau, from the federal government, a year out in kind of grant fundings, right? So like you're talking about software having sometimes 10 to 20 times the budget that some of the programs in child welfare have. We're spending the money in the wrong places. Some of the other things I just want to highlight about the investigative process is that 53% of all Black families will experience an investigation before their child's 18, 53%. And 10% will experience being in foster care. So much of this is about the data going in. when a police officer, school, two top referrals come in and make these referrals, this is where they end up, right? So I want to talk to you about now, what are we doing about it? So think of us as two main parts of it. One is the traditional think of us around how do we moved away from saying, let's just not be a tech nonprofit that's building software, but really do systems reform work. And so we started to do things like during the pandemic, we launched a command center, and it wasn't about us being the smartest to solve problems. It was literally about us crowdsourcing solutions that people were already having across the entire country. When the pandemic hit, people were like, hey, we can't recruit foster parents. We can't get folks into the pipeline because it's a pandemic. And we're like, this is week one. We're like, yes, you can. And so what did we do? We started to call a bunch of places. We were like, hey, DC, how does grandma get licensed? How does a grandparent get licensed if they never used technology before? They were like, oh, we get on a conference call and we mail them a PowerPoint packet. And then we do orientation while they flip through the PowerPoint packet on a conference call. It's like, great. Then we went to New Mexico. New Mexico, what do you do? Oh, we actually have already been using Zoom for the orientation, but then people have to come in usually for part 2. And so, oh, okay, that's already happening. Washington State, they actually had built out a online learning system. And so what we did was we combined all of these, and then we were like, holy crap, it's all here, the entire process from beginning to end. And then we shared it with as many jurisdictions as possible. And Binti, who's one of our partners, who licenses foster parents, within that first 30 days of March 15th to the April 15th, they had 2,500 people in the first month of the pandemic actually signed up to be a foster parent, and 70% completed the second, came back like the second course, not just the open house, but the actual orientation. So we take on, what we're doing is taking on all of these projects that prove, otherwise. When people say you can't, it's not possible, we're gonna run towards that problem. We're going to figure out how is it that we actually prove that that problem can do it. And the way that we actually do that is by actually centering the people who are impacted the most by it and those who are the closest to it. You see, there's youth and lived experience voice. There's also the voice of the front line. There's the voice of the different caregivers. And at the intersection of all these people is usually where the true solutions are. And so whenever we swing one way or the other way too much, we kind of potentially lose out on that opportunity. So for us, it's like, how do we dig super deep into understanding all the different perspectives while centering and prioritizing the experience that the child and the young person should have? And that is how we've been able to start designing projects. We've been working with the Children's Bureau to connect what's happening at the federal level to the people directly. During the pandemic, this was critical. People needed information. They needed to know and get hints on what was or what's not going to come, right? Young people needed to be spoken to directly from our federal leaders. And so part of what we've been doing and focus on is how do we ensure that there's this feedback loop between those who are making decisions about us at the highest levels, and then those of us who are actually experiencing the problem, those of us who are helping out the problem, those of us who are working in the problem. One of the examples I'll give here of the power of lived experience voices, this campaign that we did, which was called Check for Us. And what this was all about was we had did a cash grant opportunity. Excuse me, allergies are killing me. Hold on one second. I promise it's not COVID. But I think we're all pretty COVID safe right now in this medium. So during the pandemic, one of the things that we experienced was really being able to go ahead and, one of the things that we experienced was that people got stimulus checks, right? But for many foster youth who had aged out, who didn't go back home, didn't get adopted, didn't have those connections, you were really in a bad situation because you can't couch surf as much, when it's a pandemic. Think about the first couple of weeks. McDonald's was shut down. So many people were having so many problems getting Wi-Fi to connect with people because you couldn't just sit in McDonald's and charge your phone anymore. So we had thousands of young people actually flooding the gates. we ended up putting out a cash grant. We had over 27,000 young people actually reach out to us asking for support in that medium. And what we were able to do was we were able to understand so many needs. This is literally the number of youth that we are connected to per county. And we could go down literally per actual, what's it called? Per actual zip code. We know so much information about each and every single one of those young people because they shared it for us. And so what we said with this information was, well, how do we make sure that we actually get this to the right people? So we blasted the federal government. Literally, we took everyone's email that we had that worked at Children's Bureau, and we literally attached the zip files and attached some screenshots, and we're like, this is what's going on. We sent it to every state Chafee person that we got an email for. We turned around and sent it to young people. And I just want to give you just an insight to what some of this data looks like. So we asked about housing, right? Who needed help on coaching to avoid eviction during the time? Who needed help filling out housing applications? Who needed a housing voucher from HUD, right? We asked about what their experiences were around work. We turned around, asked them about food. We turned around, asked them about their health situation, their money situation. What supports did they get from the government or not get from the government, right? And what I'll show here is just, this is what the data looked like when we got it. So all of this stuff, right? So we got a lot of stuff. Oh, sorry, hold on. Sorry, hit the wrong button. Trying to hit this button here, sheet 2. So what we were able to do is get this 27,000, and then here's a filter of who's experienced a failed adoption, which from our folks was 4,198 people. And that's about 15%. And so this begs the question of what do we do here, right? One of the things we started to look at is say, okay, we learned so much. We collected this to give Congress information about what actually happened, right? And what's happening, because Congress needed evidence around, okay, why does foster youth need an additional intervention? We already gave an intervention to the country. Why them, right? And so we were able to give some of this data to them and work with other advocates, and that passed the $400 million to be able to get out the door, right? But what we didn't realize that we collected so much information that we could actually get down to the nitty gritty. And that we can use this to actually understand. So New York, we know we have 319 young people who have experienced a failed adoption. We altogether in New York have 2,334 young people. When we want to know their housing conditions, what's their housing conditions? We can see who is where, right? Currently, as of November 2020, we still had 100 young people living in a dorm, 58 couch surfing, about 600 in a group home, 200 in 600 in foster homes, 200 in group homes, 38 homeless, 200 living with family, another almost 700 living in their own apartments. Looking at, 65 that were living in shelters, staying with a friend without a lease, system placing them with kin. So we were able to look at housing, food, employment, education, you name it, the things that they were able to do. And now the question was, how do we actually leverage that for additional systems change, right? And I'll share with that in a bit. But one of the things that we realized that we needed to do was we need to respond to these folks, and responding to 27,000 young people when they're in need is not an easy task. So what we had to figure out was how can we do the best we could to enable others at the local level by giving them the right data sets to be able to do things, but also creating different moments. Like we had a drop-in moment where we got all the employees of Box. We got 100 employees of Box, a tech company, to get prepped by their HR department on resumes and interviewing. And then we blasted all the young people and said, if you need support with your resume, if you need support with practicing for an interview, just drop in during this time. No sign up, no need to fill out paperwork, none of that. We just show up. Literally, young people showed up and got the support that they needed. And one of them actually now sits on the advisory board of a corporate a corporate publicly traded company now. So that young person really worked their opportunity there. So that was amazing. The other thing I would say is that we turned around and started to provide some supports, and we created this thing called virtual support services. And this is now running full-fledged in California. And last year we were able to do 14,000 connections to resources. We figured out, how do you streamline resource navigation? This was big for us. There were so many people who needed support, but the reality is that we could not automate this entire process. People think about resource directories all the time and think like that's the answer. But the truth is, resource directories are complicated. They are too much. The idea that you're going to get something that is 100% the match intervention that you need within the first couple of times is slim. And so what we said was, how might we leverage the funding that the feds gave to certain states like California and say, what if we leverage it? And yes, we built your website, but we built a crappier website, but actually we hire people with lived experience who have experience hacking the system and getting what they need to actually put the human in the loop. So we did what the state wanted, which was a website, but you can go in there and chat, call, email, text, an actual community responder who will act as your personal assistant to get things done. And it's not just like a 211, but it's like, we will help you call 211. We'll help you call the provider. We'll do the research on your behalf. We'll literally write the application. We'll put all the information in to get through the entire process. And what I literally have told our staff there is that I want you to feel like you are someone's personal assistant, like you are doing all the work, because that's how we should be treating our families and our young people like gold. So now we have about 2,000 families in California where we're running statewide that are kin. We have young people. We also serve TAY youth. We're connected to over 13,000 young people there. And then the last piece here, what we have is we actually just started our contract a month and a half ago to start serving adoptive families. And so we literally have kin, adoption, and transition age youth. And that's very intentional for us, because the data that we're able to get from all three allows us to start thinking about, what is it that could be a policy change that actually influences resources for all three, right? So many times we make your eligibility of a program based on, oh, it's been 6 months post your adoption, so now you can be eligible for X, Y, and Z. Oh, young person, you've aged out for this long. Oh, kin care provider, you can only qualify for TANF because you're not licensed, so you can only get $200 a month. Oh, this and that. But I think that we can actually start pushing towards a place where, is there a policy that could be created that serves at the intersectionality of the issue? So actually addressing the risk factor versus the actual label of the person. And who knows if that's possible? I honestly don't know. But the first step is getting a ton crap of data about what people's needs are. How did you solve those needs? What actually worked for them? And then if we can start to identify trends between the intersectionality of these things, maybe we can create policy and funded programs that actually reside at the intersection of the actual problem of these folks, but actually address the risk factor and not the label of the person. This is why we literally last night, we launched the Center for Lived Experience. And the Center for Lived Experience is here so that we can build proximity at scale, so that those closest to the actual problem are the ones helping actually build it. And those three different pillars of this is going to be participatory research and data. It's about going in and being able to get data the way that we have, but invite those folks who are on this journey with us, doing data, right? Excuse me, who share some data with us, to even go deeper with them and say, listen, let me invite you to a study about failed adoptions. Let me invite you to a study about what were the supports that were needed. I'll go back to actually this right here. One thing I want to show y'all is that, the question around why are we having so many failed adoptions is a really good question, right? Here, 1 second. Oh, wait, let me remove housing. And I was very curious about it. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was that when I looked at who had group home experience and who had a failed adoption, 3 out of every 4 of the young people who had a failed adoption had experienced a group home at one point. 3 out of 4. So 75% of the folks who had a failed adoption actually were in a group home before. What does this tell me? It tells me that I'm curious about researching what were the biggest pain point moments where trauma had come out. Did that family get support? Did the young person get support? What was the intervention? And, and then being able to go ahead and understand a little bit more about that might actually help us understand a little bit more about what are the post-adoption services that families actually need, right? Because when I see a number like this, what it tells me is that this potentially, from a data point, is a disruptive moment. It's an offboarding moment. This is something to investigate thoroughly so that we know what were the supports that were needed so that these adoptions are not failed this way. But you're talking about literally a sample size of 27,000, 4,000 of which who had this failed adoption, 3,000 of those 4,000 literally lived in a group home. That means there was at one point, there was an intervention that was needed and support that was needed there. So let me go back here. So we established a center so that we can start leading into these questions. I mean, people have given us really rich insight into their experiences. And if we can start doing this, then it'll be helpful. One of the things that we challenged folks to think about was that we can get this level of data from adults. And so people were like, no, adults don't like to fill out forms. They don't like to use technology this way. And long behold, we were like, okay, whatever, we're just gonna do it. And we did the same process and we were able to actually, this is unreleased. We will be releasing soon. And what we were able to do was literally get just as much rich information from kin care providers and adoptive families. And not only did we get enough information from them to understand their needs and what they're struggling with and what are the things that they need, we actually ran a latent class analysis, which is where software basically groups people together based on the similar stories or data points that they're telling us. And in it, we found 4 different type of classes. Number 1, this is what the sample size looks like altogether, right? Like, oh, it looks like people are having like these type of low to moderate needs. Most people make under $40,000 a year. 60% of them are licensed. Here are some of the things. But when we start to break down, what does 20% of the folks are like experiencing like low to needs. Another 30% are experiencing a little bit moderate needs here. But this is where I stay up at night. Class 3 and class 4 are experiencing high basic needs, high interpersonal needs within the family. When I look at this 22% here about how much this population needs in terms of the multiple things, you're talking about 7 or 8 things that they need all at the same time. These folks are at risk of real disruption. They have 2 to 3 kids in their home, making under $40,000 a year, suffering from basic needs, suffering from the interpersonal needs that are happening in the home around trauma. They're at risk of coming into the system. So we had we were doing this for virtual support services, right? So we had one workflow. We send you text messages, we call you, you fill out the form, we talk to you. But these folks right here, you know what we realized? We were not serving them well. And we were not serving them completely well was because they need 4 or 5 calls because they got so much on their plate. They're literally so busy with trying to survive that they need us to be talking to them more. Folks up here, you can text them once, call them once, remind them once, and they'll be fine. They'll engage. And so you're getting engagement, from here. You get engagement from the different places here. So that was some of the stuff that why we want to lean into research. The second thing we want to lean into is community building. what we realized here is that we can have all of these functionalities and it will make one organization be able to have impact. But imagine if like all the organizations in our sector were able to use data this way. We're able to center lived experience. We're able to go ahead and literally have this data-driven approach to literally the next things that they're doing, right? We made 14,000 connections last year to resources, but in reality, when I look deeper into it, we didn't have the dent in the nowhere near the impact that we wanted with those families who were in class 4, the families who were in hyper extreme need, right? Like we lived in that low, moderate, kind of need, but did we go deeper into that? No, we didn't know, right? And so now that we know, we can go ahead and do better. And so if more of us are enabled with this type of approaches, whether it be this same exact method or another method, the idea here is that we're taking lived experience data and we're using it to transform the way that we show up for people in our practice, in our rules, and everything that we're doing. And we're trying to move away from that one size fits all. Arguably, with the different classes, there might be 3 to 4 different tracks or practices within the same program, right? Once you know who's who. And then there's so much that's happening on the ground that we want to bring that to proximate policy. We want to create what we're calling proximate policy. The idea that when policy is being decided, that we actually have the evidence of lived experience people informing it so that decisions are not being made for you. This is important because in our study, right, in this program that I just shared about VSS, one of the things that's clear to me is that, that became very clear to us is that we had to, that's mandated, should I say, is that we have to be in the clearinghouse, the family first clearinghouse. So that means we have to go through an evaluation. So we got to pay a lot of money, okay, to get evaluated. Then once you get evaluated, then you can go get into this thing called the clearinghouse, which is one organization who has the power to determine whether you're basically going to be able to get federal reimbursement for your program or not. Right? And states really want to make sure that they're getting their federal reimbursement. So one of the things we discovered in this process was that we could literally discriminate against all the people in class 3 and class 4 and say that our program population are for people who have low to moderate needs, get an evaluation on those needs, not serve the zip codes where they're service deserts. There are literally zip codes where we don't have a referral for literally 50 miles, right? So we've had to be creative about how we recruit people to actually serve our families. So we're not just doing resource navigation. Now we also have a partner collaborative where we have that collaborative exclusively serving some of the places where we just don't have the resource. But the reason I bring this up is because there's something so broken about our process where the business decision for me to keep this, multi-million-dollar program running in the state of California meant that I really should focus in on only a few of the individuals versus all of them. We decided to serve all of them. If that impacts the evaluation, oh well, but we wanted to make it very clear that, look, this is a loophole. And so we presented that loophole to the Children's Bureau. We presented that loophole to the actual HHS secretary. Because this is where regulation should not be incentivizing us to actually discriminate against people living in service deserts, which is going to be rural families and young people, and then discriminate against other service deserts that tend to be people, very high impoverished areas where people of color are concentrated. And we can show you the data from zip code to zip code on that. So we want to be able to make sure that our policy is actually proximate and that there's a feedback loop. And so all of our direct service is to what end? The end is to understand enough that we're able to actually tell the feds, tell Congress, hey, this is actually how things are playing out on the ground. And once we've learned enough, it's about how does it scale? And most of the time, that's not going to look like us. So right now, New York is building a warm line. We did not tell New York hire us to create it. We said to New York, hey, New York, as you're building this warm line for transition age youth, we will go ahead and tell you we will go ahead and tell you all of the things that we are learning and what's going well and what's not going well and so forth. So that's one. The last thing I kind of want to share with you is a bit more about our participatory research and how we're taking a very deeper approach to it. We did an away from home report that studied the youth experiences in institutional placements, right? And what we did was we basically wrote 150 pages about what were young people experiences in group home settings. But we followed not just the academic rigor, but we did a critical review, a peer review, a lived experience review. We had participants review what we did, right? We also turned around and made sure that when we were doing our selective process, we followed a methodology that wouldn't just have us picking the most extreme experiences, good or bad. So we did that and we came up with this report. And I just wanted to share a bit of this with you all because we're doing quite a bit to stop unnecessary institutional placements. What we found overall was that, like, look, institutional placements failed to meet the mandate of child welfare. Young people, time and time again, felt like they were being punished for being in these places, and that it was carceral, right? There was more trauma that they were experiencing day in and day out in these institutions than any of us will find acceptable, and that we were actually shielding them from creating family, right? We were actually not actually doing what the mandate is here, which is you're either going to go back home or we're expanding that forever family for you. Here are some of the things that young people shared with us. We asked young people to create a drawing, some type of picture of something that they would put in a museum to actually illustrate their experiences. This young person wrote, "I think what I drew as a piece that symbolizes us, the kids in foster care, feeling trapped. I do not want to fail in my life, and I feel trapped in the fear of getting old. I also think it shows how the adults are turned on one another, but there's these children inside them trying to get out. You see a almost prisoner-like setting because being in the system can feel like a prisoner or a life sentence." I just want to provide a trigger warning for some of the material that you're about to see. Sorry that I didn't start off with that. The ugly truth of the system, raping your mind and your body, killing you from the inside out. We ask young people to submit poetry to describe their time. Normal. What is normal? Is it a feeling? Perhaps an emotion? Whatever it is, I will never know. Is it a prescription? What aisle is it at the grocery store? Is it something I can even afford? Wherever would I find it? What does it smell like? Can you touch it? Perhaps it tastes good, but how would I know if I found it? What is normal? I was an LGBTQ youth place in a placements that were not accepting. This is why I wrote this poem. I want to end second to last slide here with this here, which is, I think, the most powerful quote. And really, lately, we've been leaning into permanency, family, kinship care, adoption, and so forth. This young person wrote, "All I ever wanted was a family, but I was told I was too old, so I was kept in a group home until I aged out. I wasn't given the necessary things or resources to survive. Once I got out, and I got kicked out of my program for not being productive because I lost the will to live because I didn't know what to do with my life now that it was my own." So when I think about where we're at today as a system, I truly believe we need to move our systems to a place where, one, we are not having everyone who's in the foster care system presently there today, right? Like, there's a bunch of young people who just don't belong in the foster care system. There were neglect issues, there were poverty issues. We had to find other interventions. When a child is abused and a child is being harmed, it's time to intervene. And yes, I do believe there should be a system that takes that responsibility into account and do that work. And sometimes that means expanding that forever family. And I dream of a day where things can be a little bit different, even between the relationships between bio families and adoptive families and foster families and kin families, because there is a way to coexist. And I'm so encouraged that I'm starting to see different things. For example, one bio parent and a foster parent got together to actually start an app. And this app is in its rough stages and it's getting started, still prototyping. But the concept is, how do you have an app where a foster parent has access without sharing any of their information, but you can chat with the bio parent in a very transparent way that the worker can see, where you can say, this is what my child likes to eat. This is what my child needs. Here's what they're allergic to and so forth, because there's such a gap there, right? How do you have these safe mediums of communication? I know that for one of our staff people, the complexity of having biological family members into the kids' lives at this moment while they're early teens has been a journey. What supports do we actually have for that? Where's the coaching program that's like, here's the conversation that you have with the family about revealing information, right? When do we do it together? How do we provide those insights of these very traumatic moments that, may not be happening? Probably Monday, start of the school week, not a great time. How do we actually be able to build out the tools and the infrastructure to like have those type of supports so that folks are getting supported in the way that they need? So I want to say, I'm going to end this with what came out yesterday, which is our second edition of Aged Out. And this is where we study the experiences, what's went wrong in Aged Out. And there's a particular chapter that I wanted to leave with each and every single one of you, which is the chapter around supportive adults. And in it, it talks about how what we studied from 209 young people and staff, frontline folks and supporter, what we learned was that young people are hiding some of the personal connections that they have in their life, right? And I'll show you actually. I love visuals, so forgive me for flipping a lot. But they have connections in their life, and so many times what happens is that we end up actually not having those connections be fostered enough. And so here you'll see, when we were asking young people, who are your supporter, who are your people? They're like, I don't have anyone. I don't have anyone. But then we started to ask them, just map out the adults in your life. Okay, these people start to show up. And you're like, put green next to who you feel close to. Put yellow next to who you are willing to get, who you feel you can go to get help from. And what we started to realize is that over time, the more that young people spent time in the system, the more that the folks who got the yellow stickers were the people who were paid professionals, because we start to teach young people, reach out to your worker, reach out to your education specialist, to your employment specialist to get these supports. But we didn't create a medium where we're actually, making sure that other adults who are potential adoptive parents, who are potential kin placements, who are potential other just people who can be in this young person's network have a role. And so systematizing and programatizing so much without actually including this, I believe has been having this effect where you literally see this 14-year-old, right? Who at this point, everyone she feels close to is also someone she can ask help from, who was just in the system for less than 3 months, to the point where you see this. So I wanted to leave that one, and thank you so much for dropping the links in the chat here, and some of the data in the chat too about what we shared there. But I think that we're just living in such a interesting time where we can actually have so much radical change in our system, because people are kind of fed up with government, right? People have realized during the pandemic that, whoa, government can make decisions about your life that you sometimes agree with or don't agree with. And so now there's this proximity to understanding a little bit of that frustration that I believe that is really empowering people right now to think about, how do we make the system better? And so I wanted to share all this with you all. And I was excited to share all of this with you all, because I actually think that we're in this moment where we have to figure out how we all come together around kin, around adoption, around transition age youth. And if we can start to create the conversations about what are all the commonalities between the three different sectors, and like what exactly is needed from all three, where there's overlap, and there's going to be uniqueness, right? Don't get me wrong. There's going to be unique needs, but I do think that it'll make a stronger front. Right now, we talk about transition age youth, and that's 28,000 young people who age out, but that's 880,000 young people between 14 and 26 who have at least spent one day in foster care after their 14th birthday. It's a very different situation, right? Then we turn around and we think about the folks who are adopted. Those are millions. Right now, to change the system, we're going to need collective power, and we're going to have a lot of people involved. And so for me, I'm like, if the folks who are super passionate about adoption, and the folks who are super passionate about kinship, and the folks who are super passionate about transitioning youth had a united agenda in front, like, what could it be done? So I want to thank you all for having me today, and I'll open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you so much. And if you want to ask a question by taking your voice off mute, feel free to do that. We have a lot of great comments. Wow, tech with love. I love the wealth of information. Continue this awesome work. Amazing. Thank you. I know the use of data mining and zip code mapping. I love the use of it.
I would have to say, I'm going to start stealing that tech with love.
Good.
Jacqueline, I'm going to start crediting you everywhere.
So do we have any questions? You know, because this would be, you're in the presence of greatness and you get a chance to ask them directly.
Oh.
You know, as much as it's possible, I don't think I've been to a more fulfilling kind of presentation where the answers and the questions and the information, I feel like almost like I can walk out right now and be better. just haven't heard what you said. And I can't wait to print out some of that information and really kind of get into it. I mean, I just love the idea of child welfare as problem solvers, you know, and people coming in and saying, this is my problem, you know, and not having to, you know, fit into the box. Well, if you were in this box, in that box, I mean, that's just revolutionary. If we could ever get to that place, man, we'd have something then.
Yeah, I think that there's really interesting things to explore. I mean, one of my staff is an adoptive parent. And one day she came to me and she's like, you know, Sixto, I adopted these 3 kids and I'm starting to believe I should not have adopted them. And I was like, girl, you can't be working here and be returning children. You know, I was looking at her. Don't tell HR I said that. But I was looking like, what do you mean? You know, and when she dug into it, she was like, you know, and I was like, so I asked the question, tell me more. You know, that's my way of being like, so I was like, tell me more. And she's like, you know, she's been talking to BioMom and for the last 1.5 years, and BioMom had another baby. And she literally has been supporting and like almost co-parenting this other child. And she was like, I could have been perfectly satisfied being the co-parent in this relationship without the kids having to sleep at my house every day. You know, I could the same role that I'm doing now, like, am I you know, is there a world where I could have just been that person legally? Could you legally have been the person, but also not terminating the rights of mom, but making all those decisions that mom can't make because of some of the things that she's experienced in life, but still be there just as much? And so it's just such an interesting, you know, conversation, because all the mediums that exist actually exist where you have to take away from the bio parent in order to give to the other person. And so could there ever be a medium where you share that type of that type of legality without the threat of you're losing, you know, here? So it was just so interesting to me that was where the conversation had gone. And I just wonder, you know, what are the innovative models? And I think that we need the array. I'm not saying we should replace traditional adoption with anything. Let me be very clear. But I think that we don't have enough options. And I think that there might be additional options out there that people could be playing and really starting to lean into. Lisa and Dory, I want to thank you for lifting up those things. We'll definitely dig into like a little bit more about guardianship. But I also, like Lisa, you're saying that this is what sounds like customary adoptions in the Native American community.
Yeah. You know, we are advocating strongly to give certain foster parents the ability to do a kin gap guardianship. The thing that prevents it in this state is they didn't know the young person before the young person moved in with them. But now they're there for over a year, and the choice is stay in foster care or leave foster care with supports through a kin gap guardianship program. And we are strongly advocating for that, so the young people don't have to stay in care. We're not terminating anybody's parental rights, and it gives me the feel of a customary adoption as well, because the parents are making a commitment, beyond their years in care. So that might be something to look at nationwide as well. It's sort of like the third option where you don't have to terminate parental rights, but the young person and the family get out of the system with the resources of the system. We have a presenter tomorrow, our keynote tomorrow, Dr. Sharon McDaniel, who's going to talk about how she did that with an agency in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh.
Yeah, amazing. And I love Dr. McDaniel. She is fair, she is amazing, and she plays no games.
That's right. Yeah. So everybody stay with us, because that's another great keynote tomorrow. But that's something we've been advocating for here in New York State. Haven't gotten a bill for it yet, but we're working on it.
Awesome.
Pam Roberts, go ahead.
Can I ask, one of the data sets that you showed showed that some of those foster kids who were reporting basically a failed adoption, they were living with families. Does that mean they had returned to some sort of biological family?
Hold on one second. Well, we didn't ask, folks got to ask their own question, like define family as they had defined it.
Yeah.
But what we can do is hold on one second. This is current.
Because there was a separate line item for living in foster care. So I'm assuming living with family. Yeah, living with family, not foster care. There we go. So returning to their own family. It's a pretty significant number.
Yeah, living with family.
Kids who are returning, and I'm just wondering, so many times we talk about, and I know you talked about, when there's not abuse, when it's neglect, we need to intervene for that family and not move so quickly toward terminating parental rights, but shoring up a family so that the children have their needs met emotionally, physically, otherwise. And I'd love to see more on that. I'd love if you can point me toward anyone who's doing more with that. I'd love to see that.
So I have to think about like who to point you to, but put some stuff in the chat so that I can even send it with my team. Sometimes I just like to block and Slack.
Yeah.
What people are like, hey, someone's looking for this. And sometimes we get interesting stuff.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was extraordinary.
No problem.
We have a few more minutes. Anybody has any other questions? And Michelle, you put a question in the box with so many abbreviations. I wouldn't ask the question, right? But if you want to ask it, feel free. Michelle Krager. All right, I guess he's no longer here.
Hi, Pat. This is Tara. This is Tara Lynn Lehman from Westchester County,
Hey, Tara.
DSS. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Sixto, I have to tell you, and I'm sure I'll be joining the choir here, but your presentation is exceptional. And one of the most compelling, if not the most compelling that I've seen in terms of the combination of your strategic story sharing with the data. Remarkable. I wanted to ask, if you're comfortable, what is it as a professional leader, but also as someone who is a credible messenger to the highest degree, where is your learning your growth as a professional. Like, what is it that you still would like to know? Because you know so much already. But what is it that you feel, where's your learning? Where's your growth as a leader?
Mhm.
And also just as a person, I just, I think we all find
Yeah.
you just such a pioneer. So anyway, let me stop and let you speak.
Gosh,
Thank you.
if you had to name two things, I'd probably say like this is gonna sound funny, but like time management is still always a struggle. Like there's
That's real.
always so much to do, and blocking it off and like getting through all the emails and so forth. And then I would also say like, I feel like you know, what I'm starting to learn more and more and more is about management.
Mhm.
And it's about how our company right now is about to be like 40-ish people. It's very
Oh,
different when
great.
you were like 10, and you knew
Mhm.
everybody.
Mhm.
Now you have to just create environments where like it used to be like you had 10 people who were executing what you wanted them to execute. Now it's about how do you create an environment where you get great folks and you let them run. You create the container for them to be able to do great work. It's a
Mhm.
very different experience than I have an idea, let's go, versus
Uh-huh.
how do I make sure that when someone else has an idea in the company, that they have the resources, the support, the infrastructure, the workflow process to actually be able to run with that and dig deep. So that's one. And then for
Mhm.
learning, I just really just learned this about myself.
Mhm.
Literally like 2 weeks ago, I was feeling so down, like very just worn out. And then people are like, "Oh, it's a
Mhm.
pandemic," and I didn't. And it actually wasn't that. Like now I know what it was. It was that I wasn't spending enough time in other spaces because it's in the
Mm.
other spaces. Like when I go to Silicon Valley and I learn about a new type
Mhm.
of analysis, what brings me joy is to bring that into our sector,
Mhm.
to use text messaging. The text messaging I was showing you there is like text messaging that like tactics that Salesforce was using to, and others to actually figure out how to market something to you. The
Mm.
analysis of creating that application the way we did, we didn't go out and say, "Hey, folks, do this survey." That would not have gotten 27,000 responses. I
Right,
looked at
right.
how the Trump campaign and Cambridge Analytics use these different. In step one of using misinformation to manipulate people, they had to collect information. And I said, if
Mhm.
they can collect that much information about what people are thinking to manipulate them, then we should be able to collect this much information to understand what they truly need. you know
Right,
and
right.
so I was like, let's use that tactic. So I think for me, it's spending time in other non-related child welfare things and then saying, how do we bring that home?
Wonderful, thank you. Well,
Wow.
on behalf of Westchester County DSS, and I know several of my colleagues, directors, managers, supervisors are on this call and have learned from you. We appreciate you, your innovation and your team, and we look forward to learning more from you in the future. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thank
Thank
you,
you.
Tara, and thank you, Westchester. I really appreciate that you all are here. So Michelle, I see
Of
you put your
course.
face. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks for tossing me the ball there. I came from a .com startup back in the day, so I appreciate so much what you're doing with the zip code maps, with the data mining, and I've been down in the weeds there, and I know the amount of hours you and your team have put in, and all respect. Now I have a question, and I hope it's an outdated question, but I got to ask it. Because I've seen during COVID, Chromebooks have been distributed, and there have been local charities making that happen. Is this still an issue? Is there a program to ensure that foster youth or aged out youth have access to this, to your program? Because you talk about them being able to input. So do you have a program that really keeps access management smooth on the software side? And then is there a program that will provide devices on the hardware side?
I would have to shout out iFoster. My understanding is that they're doing the kind of cell phones and laptop distribution to the devices.
Awesome.
For us, where we've really focused in on is there are decisions being made about people. How do we get data that makes federal people feel very confident about decisions?
Okay.
Like that was the very kind of niche thing to like hyper focus on. So that then that way it can have its ripple effect. It's kind of why it's hard sometimes to be like, this is our impact, because it's just like you have to influence the influencers.
Thank you. That's a really useful answer. Keep doing what you're doing. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amy, I noticed you had your hand up for a second. Did you want to ask a question?
No, I was just clapping. I was
Oh.
loving the response and all this work on data.
All right. Oh, we got another minute or two, folks. If you got any other questions, and is there anything else, Sixto,
Anita.
that you want to
Anita has a
leave us
question.
with?
Anita has a question.
Oh, Anita, go ahead, Anita.
I think it's me, right? Annette?
Oh, Annette.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't an Anita who had a question, actually.
I'm dyslexic, so I'll be reading all types of crazy names. It's like,
So
I'll
is
just
my
make your
son,
name
so
sound crazy.
I'm right there with you. I understand it. I have a question about the failed adoptions. Do you have statistics on whether they went back to their bio families or?
So when I look at this, I have to dig a little bit deeper. Again, they defined family, so however they ended up defining it, that's how it ended up. What you call it? Like, so I wasn't like, did you go back to bio family? But living with a family member. Oh wait, failed adoption. Hold on. So the way to read this is, as of November 2020, we had, out of the 4,000 folks, they said they're living with a family member. 400 of them said they're living with the family member.
Okay.
84 of them said they're living with a kin. So the system placed me with an actual kin relative.
Okay.
So that gives you kind of a number there. Yeah, so like this is what we would do, right? So like what we're trying to build the center to do is, now that we have this lead and this question, and if there was like a concrete opportunity, the way we got consent for the data was that we would use the data only in a way that actually improves the system or resources flow to young people. So there's a special consent that we got from young people about how to use this data. And so what we would do is say, oh, okay, now we're gonna go launch a new study to go ahead and contact these 84 young people, let's just say, and ask them about what happened. Or we might want to say our new study will sample like 3 of these different areas, folks who said living with families, living with blah, 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 and we might ask 20 people, each of them, and interview them, and then like dig into those questions. And then what we're gonna do with our center is not just keep that in-house, but start to be able to work with different researchers and say, okay, if you follow these particular practices around lived experience, practices that we want you to do, then we'll do it. We have the clinical supervisor, right, that we make referrals to when we are doing research, because research can be so extractive. We have, not only just the referral pathways, but we make sure that young people are fed the day of. So like whether we're Uber eating you or Cash Apping you money, so that you have money available to you on the day of, so that you can, like, by the time the interview comes, at least that's taken care of. And then we also compensate young people for their time. The questions that we ask, we run by other people with lived experience to make sure that they're landing well. So we have a person with lived experience from the beginning of the project all the way through, who's actually been trained to go ahead and be part of that entire process. And so we want more people to do research that's not just extractive, and that does not leave people just like in a very bad state, which is hard. Sometimes you're interviewing people who are homeless if you're doing a homeless, study. And so it's very hard. So it's a bit of extra work, but I believe it's so worth doing.
And how would organizations contact you about working in allyship with you? I'm a board member of 2 national adult organizations that represent adult adopted people, many of whom were adopted through foster care.
Yeah, let me drop a link in here.
Perfect, thank you. This was mind blowing, these statistics.
I think I have the link. Hold on 1 second. If one is definitely our general website, we have a process. Okay. So let me just give you that too. Here you go.
Perfect, thank you so much.
No problem. And that looks like this.
Excellent.
You can, and then here, and then that will get fed to ops, and then they'll start to route it.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Well,
Hey,
just wanna-
I had a quick structural
Okay.
kind of question, if I could.
Yep.
Yep.
You talk about having so many people with lived experience. What kind of scaffolding or what kind of things do you guys use that, you know, if you're having people who use wheelchairs, you got to build ramps. What kind of scaffolding do you include in your organization for folks with lived experience?
Oh, Jesus only knows I've been learning. You know, the reality is that, you know, those who are close to problem, like we sometimes, even myself, don't realize how we're digging into a new topic, how it would affect you, right? So for some folks, no triggers whatsoever doing the day-to-day work, but then let's just say we get into siblings. And it's, you know, a lot to figure out. I think for us, the number one scaffolding has been grace. So like there's a job to do. Sometimes we want to staff a research project with one or two extra people, depending on the intensity, because someone might have to tap out, and that tap out shouldn't be punished. Because when you're hearing young people, for example, in our Away From Home report, talking about suicide, like literally the suicide they witnessed and so forth, like it's hard when you've had that same experience and then you're being exposed to it. So for me, it was it was important to think about how we provide grace. There have been times where we've had to give people 2 or 3 weeks leave to kind of recuperate. And then really we've been saying, instead of doing self-care, really people say self-care, it's really like aftercare. It's like you burn to the point where you need it, but then like, how do you consistently inject into it? And so like we told folks, for example, in January, the organization is going to go through an experience where it is going to ramp up, and we're launching a center in May. It's going to be Hell Month. June, I want all project plans to be light. July, everyone will be off the first week of July. Take your complete week off. Do no emailing, do not bother people, you know, book your vacations, go out of the country. I will be out of the country, you know, like I'm not, but I tell them that. I still haven't picked a place. But then like, go ahead and do all of that. So then like you actually build it into the structure, because it gets intense. So there's a question of velocity. How fast are we moving? Then there's a question of intensity. How intense is the material? And the exposure to all of the things that you start to carry. Because when someone shares their narrative, you now carry that narrative with you. And that can be very, very hard when you're literally hearing hundreds of stories of injustice, and you're like, damn, if this one moment would have been different, could we have done something different?
Well, that's an excellent question to end on, Chester, because it's a good question. It's something you always have to be pondering. And Sixto, you're so humble, you're so persistent, you're so smart. And I'm glad to hear that you also are thinking about taking care of yourself, whether we call it self-care or aftercare. The thought is in your mind, which is and for you and your staff. So thank you for sharing that with us as well. But we wouldn't have even known if the question wasn't asked. And
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I really had wanted to do this. Like I said, Pat, you were instrumental in shifting and challenging one of the mental models that I had. And number two, New York is where I have so much of my biological family. And so I welcome anything from New York. So happy to be all of yours company.
Well, then let's consider this to be continued.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.